Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Patrick Hotle. He teaches courses in world civilizations, European arts and letters, Age of the Crusades, the Middle East, medieval Europe, and classical Greece and Rome at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. He is the chair of the History and Foreign Language Department at the college. He also established the Study Abroad program at Culver Stockton and has taken students on numerous study abroad courses, including to the countries of Turkey, Italy, Israel, and many others. Dr. Hotle was named the John A. Sperry Endowed Chair in Humanities in 2003 and won the Helsebeck Prize for Excellence in Teaching in 2009. He is also a former recipient of the Governor's Award for Excellence in Teaching from the Missouri Department of Higher Education. And we are very pleased to have the distinguished historian and decorated professor with us today. Welcome, Dr. Hotle.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, there were several kingdoms in Western Europe at the end of the 11th century, for the most part, the feudal system, but there were markets developing and a population growth which must show a level of stability, not exactly the Dark Ages leading up to the First Crusade.
That's absolutely right. Of course, historians go crazy when the
Sure, yeah.
the sort of 10th, 11th century are seen as or even the 9th century, seen as the Dark Ages. Actually, as you suggested, the economy of Europe was growing. There was some considerable degree of expansion in population. The various explanations for this. One is a sort of warming of the weather, so that there was a kind of warming trend that meant that one could farm a little further up the mountainsides and improve nutrition just a little bit more, which would make it just that much more likely that babies would survive. And so there definitely was, of course, with that, much is made of the expansion of trade and the growth of cities. And so all this is well before the Crusades, and that Europe had gone through one hates to call it a dark age, but a period in the 7th, 8th centuries when there had been some political difficulties, and so there was instability and an early visitation of the plague and several things like that. And Europe was coming out of that by the time we think about the First Crusades.
Dr. Hotle, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Absolution Belgian-style quadruple from the Crusader Brewing Company of Bakersfield, California. This Belgian quad has been aged for 4 months in Tobin James Zinfandel barrels on Murray Farms organic cherries. Now, there is little agreement on the status of quadruple as a beer style, but one thing is very clear. Quads are pretty strong, with an alcohol by volume between 10 and 14%. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to become a subscriber. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest material right away, right as it's released. And to all of the listeners and supporters from 1,000 cities from around the globe, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my Absolution Belgian-style quadruple very high and to a better understanding and peaceful coexistence in the Holy Land, and for all of those standing for peace, I say cheers. So we talked about some economic and societal changes, but in regards to the Catholic Church, of course, it's very influential during that century. What was the significance of the Gregorian reform movement during that time?
Yeah, I think this is really important. I'm glad you asked this question. For some time in the 11th century, or the decades before the First Crusade, which would be 1095, so several decades before that, there were a lot of figures within the Catholic Church that were concerned that lay people had too much power over the church. The medieval sort of political theory that dominated their perceptions of how things should be was that there was a secular universe and a spiritual universe. So that should be reflected also in how society organizes itself. So the secular side, kings and nobles should manage the affairs of this world, and that the church should manage the affairs of the next. But the problem was that in this sort of troubling 9th century, the secular arm had come to dominate the church, had started appointing figures to church offices based upon family connections rather than vocation. And so there was a real sense by, the 1030s, 40s, 50s, that the church really needed to reassert control of its own affairs. And a figure who really leads that, really sort of personifies it, is Pope Gregory VII. And he becomes Pope, I'm thinking 1060, 1070, he's right in there. And he really saw his central objective as trying to free, and was really, they even used that language, free the church from the domination of kings and lords. And that meant lots of different things. It meant trying to take back control of monasteries, very practically take back control of monastic lands, take control of who gets to choose bishops and monks, and even who chooses the Pope had become wrapped up in sort of Roman city politics. Take that all away from the political realm and put it back into the hands of churchmen. So the Gregorian form was an attempt to try to fix all those things. Coupled with that was a better educated clergy. Celibacy became a major issue where it hadn't been necessarily before, to try to free clerics from family obligations, and just a host of other things to really assert the independence of the church. And of course, at the sort of the essence of this, especially in the mind of Gregory VII, was that when it became a matter of who should really dominate, it should really be the church that dominates European affairs.
Western Europe had experienced centuries of fighting, not decades, but centuries of fighting. There was a peace movement. The church is spurring a lot of that on, caught in the middle of all of these circumstances. So what was the difference between the truce of God and the peace of God?
Yeah, these are really interesting things. It shows you that I think sometimes when we think back to the Middle Ages, and of course when we look back at the Middle Ages, all kinds of misconceptions. One of them is we tend to be very cynical in our perception of the medieval Catholic Church. And in fact, when you look at what they were trying to do, it often was very good things. They really were trying to see themselves as the protectors of lower levels of society and maintain the peace and avoid violence. And especially the 10th century had been a tough century. This was a century of castle building. In France, so many of the castles, though they started off as sort of wooden objects, were constructed because it was a sort of a period of violence. The monarchy was not particularly strong. So the church stepped into this. By the time we get into the 11th century, stepped in to try to come up with various kinds of rules to control violent behavior. And there was something called the peace of God. Peace of God was to try to discourage violence against women and children and unarmed civilians. And then the truce of God was an attempt to try to further control violence by making a rule that any fighting that occurred, if it had to occur, could occur only on certain days of the week and certainly could not occur on any feast days. Well, if you look at the list of feast days of the medieval Catholic Church.
I'm Catholic, so yeah.
So you know that excludes a lot of days. So it was really a genuine attempt to try try to control violence, accept the fact that violence existed, but to try to control it. And they weren't perceived as being terribly successful. They had a little effect, but there was still I think by the end of that century, there's still a feeling with the church that they needed to do more. And that to some degree will help explain the Crusades, I think.
Yes, I think so too. Pilgrimages were an important aspect of expressing one's faith, even done for the forgiveness of sins, which is important. There were three major sites at that time that was the focus or the destination for some of these pilgrims: Rome, Santiago in Spain, and then, of course, Jerusalem, which is troublesome at the time because they can't get there. Was the focus on pilgrimage instrumental in the development of the First Crusade?
I think it really was. And in so many ways, is really crucial. I think pilgrimage, in a way, is sort of key to understanding the Middle Ages, at least the first part of the Middle Ages. And what pilgrimage was takes a little bit of explaining from our point of view. I mean, I think whenever we talk about the Middle Ages, we have to remember we're talking about a different time. They really did things differently then. And the place of pilgrimage was massive in medieval culture. Basically, there were a couple premises to it. One was that there was sacred geography. So these sacred sites that you listed, like Santiago de Compostela, Jerusalem, and Rome, because of the important religious events that occurred there, to even be near those locations was to somehow be exposed to the sanctity of religious events. And that then could be translated to not just the locations, let's say Jerusalem, the site of the crucifixion, the Holy Sepulchre, or Rome.
Peter and Paul, yeah.
Exactly, sites of all of that, but also actually the relics or the remains of the saints. And this was not just their bones, but also anything associated with them, so shrouds and crown of thorns. Eventually, a really important object was so-called the true cross,
right.
That's going to have a big role in Crusader history. And anyway, these things were seen as sort of radiating spiritual health. And in the Middle Ages, this also took on connotations of physical health, and that in an age in which there wasn't a lot of reliability of the medical profession, the idea of access to these holy relics was also seen as literally making you better, or helping you deal with problems related to fertility or something like that. So it was hugely important. And coupled with that then was also the pilgrimage going to these places there was not just tremendous benefit to be gained by visiting these locations, but the act of pilgrimage itself was seen as so good for one's spiritual growth, and often seen as the pilgrimage was a penance that then resulted in forgiveness. Tremendously important in an age that took the notion of penance and forgiveness really seriously. Hell and purgatory were vivid aspects of their mental universe. And pilgrimage was the sort of device with which they engaged with that.
What group was actually in control of the Holy Land at the end of the 11th century, and how powerful were they?
As we know, the Islamic empires, the Umayyad and the Abbasids later on, took over with great speed, really, what we call the Middle East today, so Syria and Palestine, Egypt, and clear across North Africa, and even into Spain. But as the centuries went by, these Islamic lands, too, were subject to outside invaders. Various groups of Turks moved in and took over the Islamic Caliphate, so that the caliph became a kind of puppet of these outside invaders who themselves converted to Islam. And the one important invader just before the First Crusade was a group of Turks called the Seljuk Turks. And they swept out of Central Asia, really in the 10th, 11th centuries, and came to dominate much of the Middle East and sort of moved into what today we would call Turkey, Anatolia, the eastern Turkey. And so they were really putting a lot of pressure on this area. Basically, the Byzantine Empire, who we may talk about a bit later, had been the closest Christian authority to the Middle East, and they found their borders being pushed further and further back. And they had lost control of Jerusalem really back in the 7th century and had really not reasserted it, but they found themselves being pushed even further back. the Seljuk Turks, who dominated that, sort of contested Jerusalem with another Islamic state from Egypt called the Fatimids. So there was a great rivalry over control of Jerusalem between the Fatimids out of Egypt and the Seljuk Turks, really out of Damascus. And the Seljuks really play a pretty important role in the Crusades because the Seljuks not only moved in and came to dominate the previously held Islamic world, but as I suggested, they took over big chunks of territory from the Byzantines, pushing them right back to the Bosporus. In many ways, it's the success of the Seljuks that then is the various reasons we'll talk about for why the First Crusade occurred, but one of them has to do with the success of the Seljuk Turks.
Now, many people in the Middle Ages, I can't speak for them now, but they probably felt that the end was near with the focus on the book of Revelation. I don't think it involved oversensitive hipsters, but what was millennialism? I couldn't help it. Dr. Hotle.
No, that's good. No, exactly. Yeah, I don't blame you. I would have gone for that too. There was this notion always that the Middle Ages took numbers very, very seriously, and of course they took the Bible as not only history and theology, but also prophecy. And so much was made of the year 1000, of course, because they believed that it was 1,000 years from the birth of Christ and that was significant. There's also within Christianity a lot of the writings of the period of sort of anticipation of the end of times. The book of Revelation, of course, was taken very seriously as a sort of roadmap for what was to come. So there was always a desire to try to foresee and read contemporary events as a warning for what was coming. So there certainly was, and over again in medieval history, you find these millennial movements led by inspired beings who preach and ask people to prepare for the end. Some of them actually will turn in later on. The church sort of saw them sometimes as heresies. But that was very much part of the mental universe of the 10th and 11th century, was that the end of times were around the bend and you needed to be ready.
Well, and not only that, I think that if you believe the end is near, it's easier to go on this trek across, halfway across their world at the time to the Holy Land. If you think the end is near and you need that for the absolution of your sins, they're just more apt to do it at that point.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. It all goes into a kind of cocktail, doesn't it, of motivation to encourage people to do pilgrimage. And of course, when we talk about the First Crusade, it's going to be, in some ways, the toughest of all pilgrimages, and that is to go to Jerusalem, which is the furthest away from Europe, and not only go to it, but also as an armed pilgrimage, it will be to try to win it back. Surely, as you say, the millennial motivation had to be part of the explanation.
What was the status of the Byzantine Empire? You referenced it already just before the First Crusade. The Seljuks had pushed them back. And what was their relationship with the West at the time?
So the Byzantine Empire is such an interesting story. And it's one of those things that, at least when I was in high school, was sort of overlooked because the Byzantines don't fit any of our categories. They transcend location because they're both in the Middle East and in Europe, and they transcend period. They're really a continuation of the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. And they're Christian, but not Latin Christian. They're Orthodox Christianity. So it was a little bit too much, I think, for the way we used to teach history to know what to do with the Byzantines exactly. But anyway, as a continuation of the Roman Empire, Rome in the West and European lands really had been lost to principalities and kings. But Constantinople became the capital of this continuation of Rome that then ruled over Greece and Turkey. And, until such times as they lost Jerusalem, they actually had controlled Jerusalem and much of the Middle East, and actually Egypt, before Islam pushed them out of those places and seized those areas. But the Byzantines, though they were pushed out of those areas, they still remained surprisingly strong and wealthy, and they were quite condescending towards the Europeans, who they thought as sort of upstarts and barbarians. And they're famous for their wealth and their diplomacy. Nevertheless, they were on the frontier between, as we said earlier, an expanding Islamic empires like the Seljuks. So I've heard them given credit, actually, for resisting the Islamic invasion of Europe, of Greece and the other parts. Eventually, those areas were taken by the Ottomans, but it was the Byzantines that kept that from happening for really 600-700 years.
Back to Western Europe, then. What's the background of Pope Urban II, and what were the consequences of that ecclesiastical council of Clermont that he called?
So Urban II was really kind of a protege of Gregory VII, who we mentioned earlier, who was part of the Gregorian reform movement, this attempt by the church to try to improve things, try to get the church back on top of things. And he was, after Gregory VII died, and I think might have been a pope or two in between, he was elected pope. And so he was determined to try to carry through further with the reforms. The timing was even a little bit better for him in many ways. And so he certainly intended to try to push through the reforms, either brilliantly invented new theological ideas that would enable the Crusades to occur, or took advantage of circumstances brilliantly to make the First Crusade as really as successful as it was. But the story goes that he was actually approached by Alexis of the Byzantine Empire asking for help against the Seljuks, and he either came up with the idea or rode the possibilities and began a preaching tour that included the Council of Clermont, where he met with the bigwigs of 11th century Europe and made the case for, initially, it was to send a Christian army to help our poor Byzantine Christian brothers, even though they're Orthodox Christian, which isn't quite as good as they would like it to be. Still, they're called Christians. Send an army to help them. As this developed, and it's not clear, historians sort of struggle with Urban II's motivations and how clear was he in seeing the way forward. But then this sort of military campaign with religious purposes then mingled with the notion of pilgrimage, and why not just not only help our Byzantine brothers, but even attempt to recapture the Holy Land, or if nothing else, go on armed pilgrimage towards the Holy Land. And because it's pilgrimage, of course, then it's caught up in this notion of the forgiveness of sins and penance, and pilgrimage would especially appeal to, of course, the Christian population eager for spiritual sustenance. And then on top of that, how brilliant, again, people argue about how calculated this was. What a great thing to tap, but this Christian warrior culture that, as we said earlier, had been so problematic, the church had tried to come up with the peace of God and truce of God, tap that militant Christian military tradition and send it towards the Holy Land. And on top of that, of course, this all would make the papacy look strong in its contest with the secular world, right? That the Pope is leading the army, if not literally then figuratively, into recapturing these lands in the Middle East. So it's an amazing sort of conjunction of, who knows, ideas, lucky dynamics. As I say, historians struggle with this. Infuriatingly enough, we have a lot of historians who have tried to record what the Pope preached, but they all differ a little bit, and we don't have any real reliable evidence as to what the Pope really intended.
I don't know if it's too simplistic, but I think the more successful they are at mitigating some of these or working through some of these problems between Christian states, as I mentioned before, they're right in the middle. But the more successful they are, then you create the circumstance, which you kind of alluded to, which now you have these restless, boorish, dangerous, and now idle knights that you need to get out of Western Europe. Is that too simplistic?
I think that must be part of the story. And the speed with which this message appealed to them is just remarkable. I mean, one of the things when you look at the First Crusade is you are in awe of how this idea just took off within a couple of years. And it was a very well-planned, I think sometimes when we think about the First Crusade, we think of it as a kind of spontaneous explosion of piety. And it was, we're dealing with the medieval papacy. They were well-organized and articulate and literate, and this was a well-organized campaign. But it really spoke to something in 1094-95 when the preaching occurred. And, estimates are really hard to establish as to how many people were involved in this, but I was just looking at a source earlier that suggested perhaps 150,000 people set off during the First Crusade. And of course, that it shrank dramatically through starvation and numbers and people going home again. But it was an amazingly successful message that the Pope preached.
For those that actually answer the Pope's call, no king actually goes on the First Crusade, I don't believe. But there are some interesting characters: Godfrey, Bohemond, Baldwin, Raymond, Robert of Flanders, others. Could you speak to some of those specific individuals that lead these forces to the Holy Land?
Yeah, they really was a collection of amazing, swashbuckling, kind of inspiring characters. These figures actually give me a chance to sort of make a couple of key points whenever we talk about the motivation of the Crusades and some of the myths. One of the myths is that Crusaders were the second sons who were seeking economic gain by joining this attack on the Holy Land. And that's just not the case. These figures, though we don't have any kings among them, these tended to be the very top level. These men were very powerful. Raymond of Toulouse, who was one of the leaders of the Crusade, really was more powerful than the King of France. He tended to control much of the south of France. The King of France was quite weak in those days. Godfrey de Bouillon was the Duke of Lower Lorraine. So these are really powerful men. They're not kings, but, 10th century, 11th century kings weren't all that strong.
Right.
Quite often the strongest figures were these powerful lords. So you get these characters who are really the sort of top level of the European leadership and often wealthy. Crusading was incredibly expensive. And all these men, they had no reason to go to the Holy Land because, they were wealthy men at home, and the chances of wealth on pilgrimage were minimal. And many of them came back broke. So it wasn't a financial gain was really not the goal of this. It really had to do with spiritual gain. Anyway, so these characters, you mentioned Godfrey de Bouillon, who eventually became the first, though he wasn't called king, but virtually first king of Jerusalem once Jerusalem falls to the Crusaders. And you have Bohemond of Taranto, who is my favorite, a great swashbuckling Norman lord from Sicily. We even have a description of him by Anna Comnena, who's one of our main sources, Byzantine princess who watched the Crusaders go through Constantinople on their way. And she describes him as this tall, blonde, blue-eyed character with flaring nostrils, who was, in his case, he probably really was out to try to carve for himself a kingdom. I mentioned Raymond of Toulouse is a very pious figure, and really the most powerful of all the bunch. And then there's a whole host of other really powerful figures. Hugh of Vermandois, who is the brother of the King of France, and Godfrey de Bouillon's brother, Baldwin. So there were the host of these really powerful figures. That had quite an interesting impact on the Crusades in all kinds of ways. Later on, I think these Crusades will sort of see the advantages to having a king, because the challenge is leadership. If you think about crusade as sort of armed pilgrimage, these are all individuals who are marching towards Jerusalem with their own particular spiritual goals in mind. How do you turn that into an army? When you read about the First Crusade, one of the things that amazes you is how on earth did they eventually manage to capture Jerusalem,
right,
when it's never really clear who's in charge.
Right, yeah.
It's kind of an army led by a committee, and that's usually seen as disastrous. So a great bunch of characters. Some of them will stay and establish dynasties in the Middle East, what we call the Crusader States. Some will come back home, and of course many of them will die on the way.
It would be difficult if you just took a military force, but that's not who's going. There's all kinds of people going.
Yeah.
There's probably children going.
There are.
And so that's got to complicate the whole situation. So could you speak to all of this menagerie of different people from all kinds of different places that show up and leave, and then what's the path that they take to get to Constantinople?
This message so resonated that the church had to issue instructions that no monks or women or children or people who were not soldiers should go. The truth was that, in fact, many did. In those days, armies quite often included not just the soldiers, but also their families. So a lot of crusaders brought their families with them as well. So it really was this kind of horde that moved across Europe. And there were several different, sometimes they call these There's one called the People's Crusade and the Knights Crusade. And it wasn't just all one movement. They tended to sort of gel into different hordes. So the first to arrive actually in Constantinople, and once they got to Constantinople, of course they could walk across Europe. And as you said, mostly really France, Flanders, today we would call southern Netherlands, Burgundy, this kind of northern France and German area. These were where most of the Crusaders came from. For whatever reason, the message really resonated with them. The Spaniards were told not to go because they were supposed to stay home and fight the Muslims who, as we know in those days, were in Spain. But nevertheless, despite the attempts of the papacy to try to make this into a military operation, it became something more than that. So they traveled across Europe. The first waves, and we really talk about them in terms of waves, tended to live off of the land, which you can imagine what that must have looked like when 40,000 people showed up in a neighborhood looking for food, stealing everything. So quite often these crusaders had to sort of fight their way across European Christian lands against other Christians,
right,
to find their way to the Holy Land. The first one, or they didn't get to the Holy Land, they got as far as Constantinople. The first one, led by this very charismatic character, Peter the Hermit, got as far as Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor, a little horrified at what he got. He thought he was going to get soldiers. Instead, he was getting, it's like a European sort of barbaric migration on his doorstep. He nevertheless recognizes the advantages are allies, so he ships them across to Anatolia. Today we call it modern-day Turkey, from Constantinople. That's, of course, Constantinople is what we call Istanbul today. And he puts them over there. Another wave shows up. He puts them over also onto Anatolian soil. The problem of leadership really shows itself, and purpose. And these first two waves are basically massacred by the Seljuks, which has some interesting consequences in that the Seljuks think all the Crusaders are going to be like these first two waves of sort of disorganized. And then the third wave, sometimes it's called the Nobles' Crusade. The third wave shows up, and it's really the army. It's really the armed force led by these characters that we talked about earlier, Godfrey and Bohemond and others. That's really the force that the Byzantine emperor wanted, and they are the force then who will eventually march across Anatolia into Syria and will eventually actually capture Jerusalem. But the first two waves disintegrated.
So what happens then, that trek between Constantinople and then the siege of Antioch? Because that really bogs them down for a really long time.
It does. You know, sometimes the story of this crusade, the third wave, or the Nobles' Crusade or Prince's Crusade, is sometimes seen almost as a kind of medieval Homer's Iliad, in that it takes on very legendary proportions. The story itself is so remarkable that you can see why it takes on legendary proportions. And a lot of poetry and songs and literature at the time really saw it in those terms. Of course, they also saw it as almost another chapter in the Old Testament of Christian warriors. The Middle Ages always saw the Old Testament as a sort of parallel, constantly full of wisdom, even though it's the Old Testament, speaking directly to Christians. So they saw themselves in the footsteps of David and Joshua, as great religious military figures. So this campaign has this aura of specialness about it. And to some degree, it has to be that sense of mission that explains how these soldiers, with their wives and hangers-on, and this, even the Prince's Crusade had plenty of non-combatants with them, how they could march across Anatolia in summertime, terrible heat, fight their way all the way to Antioch, which is basically the very edge of modern-day Turkey. Well, it's on the edge of Syria today. How they could do that in a matter of months and survive, you could see how their conclusion could be that this could only be explained by the fact that God was supporting them. And of course, it was an age that believed in visions, and there were a number of visions along the way that they saw. Angels joined them in battle at the key spots in the fight, and they finally get to Antioch. So they finally reach the sort of a major city on the threshold of entry into Jerusalem. And Antioch, of course, plays a huge role in early Christian history. It was supposed to be the first Christian city, the first Christian church was there. And they settled down for a siege. Antioch is held by the Muslim warriors. And here's where it starts to sound like the Trojan War. This long, dreary, endless siege. Finally, the brilliant swashbuckler Bohemond manages to arrange to be let in the gates and seizes Antioch, and the Crusaders pour in just as a much larger Muslim army is about to attack them. So now the Crusaders find themselves besieged by a much larger army. They learn that the longer they delay, the more enemy forces are going to be facing them. And so they feel like they have to go out and attack the Muslim invaders or the Muslim besiegers. And incredibly, they win. It's astonishing. And again, of course, they see this as all divine help. Some of it probably has to do with, in Antioch, they find what they think is the Holy Lance that pierced the side of Christ. Surely a good sign that God is with them. And they, of course, bring this out in battle and follow the Holy Lance in their counterattack, thus driving off the Muslim attackers. It really is amazing. You can see why they thought what they thought. And then they, from this point, after having seized Antioch and expelled the attackers, they then head down towards Jerusalem.
Does Bohemond actually stay in Antioch?
Yes. On the one hand, it's remarkable that they do as well as you do. On the other hand, for the reasons we just said, that it was leadership by committee. There's constant disagreements amongst the leadership, especially between Raymond of Toulouse, who, as we said, was the most powerful and richest, and in some ways you could say maybe the most pious, and Bohemond, who was very much looking out to find maybe a kingdom for himself. Of course, the Middle Ages saw no problem with not only pursuing your own gain, but also if you are gaining, God must approve of it. So you're being pious even while pursuing your own gain. So I'm not saying that Bohemond is not pious, but he's maybe a little bit more focused on reputation and power. Anyway, Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond argue constantly. There was this big issue with all these princes had to swear to return anything they captured from the Muslims to the Byzantine emperor. And after all, these lands had been the Byzantine emperors. And this becomes a major contention when the Byzantine emperor fails to support them in their attack in Antioch through some misunderstanding. And Bohemond then basically is determined to make himself Prince of Antioch, and he does. And he stays, and only grudgingly then are the princes, especially Raymond, ready to leave. That just seems like an unsatisfactory situation. And they're arguing about it, and the months go by, and it's really only kind of a rebellion by the ordinary soldiers that push these princes towards Jerusalem. The idea all along.
Right.
Again, the politics between these leaders was really uncomfortable, and nearly they came to blows many times.
So that final drive to Jerusalem, Bohemond stays in Antioch. So who actually goes? Is it Raymond and Godfrey? And how do they eventually take the city? Because it's not the Seljuks that are actually in Jerusalem.
Yeah. So Bohemond stays, and so it's Godfrey and Raymond who march towards the city, and there's quite a bit of disagreements between those two as well. Raymond thinks he's going to be made the first king of Jerusalem. Godfrey doesn't really think that's going to happen. They have a fairly easy journey to Jerusalem. Once they get there, it's a very difficult situation. It's very well fortified. It's newly fortified. Jerusalem had just fallen some months before. It had been held by the Seljuks, Muslim Seljuk Turks, and it had just fallen to the Fatimids in Egypt. And part of the explanation for why this army from Antioch could move down and attack Jerusalem is because the Seljuk Turks were quite happy for their rivals, the Fatimids, to have to face the Crusaders alone in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, Jerusalem, well fortified, new walls. The Fatimid garrison poisoned the wells. They made it as difficult as possible. There was no wood for fires, of course, very little food. And so in many ways, it really was a kind of desperate situation. Probably better tacticians or strategists would have said, this is not a good time to attack Jerusalem. Why don't we? And there were those that said we should go off and attack Egypt or set up some kind of a base from which to launch continued attacks. But the ordinary Crusaders were so determined to take Jerusalem. Remember, this was an armed pilgrimage that they pushed their leaders into attacking when they really weren't ready. And they launched an attack or two, and it failed. And again, visions came to their aid. They got a vision from one of their priests saying they should walk around the city of Jerusalem barefoot and sing songs in preparation for the miracles that would help them capture the city. And they did. Of course, the garrison was amazed as these barefoot crusaders marched around the walls singing hymns, but they didn't attack them. And in an almost miraculous sort of way, ships showed up nearby the port of Jaffa, Genoese ships, in which the Crusaders saw the opportunity to dismantle the ships and make siege engines from them. And so, sure enough, they then spent another month or two building these siege towers, really two. And July 13th, 14th, so you can imagine this is the height of Palestinian summer. They attack, and incredibly, Godfrey de Bouillon's men break through and capture the city. So it is kind of, as I say, from a military standpoint, it's kind of amazing that it was successful, but it was.
You know, I kind of imagine, and maybe this is incorrect, that the Crusaders get there after this very long trek and all of these difficulties and battles and everything that they've endured. And then many of them probably felt, we've accomplished our goal. We've made the pilgrimage. Now it's time to go home. That's got to be a problem for the security, the follow-on security.
It really was. And here's where I think there are various myths associated with the Crusades. One of them is that the Crusades were kind of proto-colonialism, and historians think that's just not the case. Because, as you said, what happened is the Crusaders finally took Jerusalem, and once they took it and saw the holy sites, remember, they're pilgrims, they went home. The vast majority went home. And so there was this tiny remnant left to try to hold the city.
That is like the Odyssey.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It really is. And so it was a kind of desperate situation. Again, it could have been, I think the Crusade was a bit of a shock to the Muslim world, and it took them a little while to respond. And once they did respond, they responded quite successfully. But because of that, they were sort of lucky in that they weren't really attacked for a time. So a feudal kingdom of Jerusalem was set up under the heirs of Godfrey Bouillon, and his brother becomes the first king. And then there was a principality of Antioch set up under the relatives of Bohemond. Eventually, there were 5 different Crusader states officially under the control of the king of Jerusalem. But they all suffered from a chronic problem of not having enough men. And here's where, when we think about the Crusades, we tend to talk about the big 7 Crusades as if there were 7 different events. But really what happened over the course of the next 200 years is Europe responded to the fact that Europeans had taken the Holy Land by a sort of supplying a constant flow of crusaders who come and spend a year maybe or less and then go home again. The idea being that they're sustaining control of the holy places, but they don't really want to stay. But there's this constant flow. It's not just 7 crusades. It's kind of a 200-year period of a ready batch of armed pilgrims who see some sort of a journey to Jerusalem, even though they can't take part in the great mythical First Crusade. They are nevertheless still being crusaders by going there. But that was why that was really necessary to hold these places. So in other words, these Crusader states in many ways were held with the help of sort of temporary pilgrims who then would leave after a few months.
So my last question for you is the Knights Templar. Are they a part of that whole dynamic that you just described?
They really are. Early on, there was a feeling that there needed to be someone to protect pilgrims because pilgrims continued to, not armed pilgrims, just ordinary pilgrims continued to want to go to Jerusalem. And so there was a constant flow across Anatolia, even though this was, sometimes often Muslim-controlled territory. The pilgrims continued to come. So there was seen a need for some sort of protection and maybe some kind of organization to just protect pilgrims. The other thing related to that pretty quickly was the idea of someone needing to take care of pilgrims once they arrived in Jerusalem. And of course, the immediate need apparently was hospitals, places for people, for pilgrims to stay. And so stepping into that need then, this very novel idea of warrior monks. And it took a while for the church to accept that. It was only thanks probably to the support of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a major character in medieval history and is kind of a medieval rock star. I kind of hate to use that metaphor, but that's as good as I come up with. Hugely influential. And he supported the idea of this very new vocation of armed monks. And the first of the bunch were what we call the Templars. They were given lands in area what they thought was the Temple Mount. We know it today as Al-Aqsa Mosque. They thought it was King Solomon's temple. And so they set up this military order that graduated and expanded and got larger and larger. And it really turned into satisfying the need that you just mentioned of trying to come up with some permanent soldiers to stay there and hold the territories in the Holy Land. Of course, famously, they became very rich. People gave them lots of money. And of course, money became a substitute for pilgrimage. I guess it always has been to some degree. And so in time, if you go to the Middle East today, modern state of Israel, you'll find that there are Crusader castles all over the place. Big, fine, magnificent, ferocious-looking castles. But notice that they're castles that are really designed to be held by not very many men, because there just weren't that many men to hold them.
Well, I gotta say, this is such an interesting topic. You got knights and these interesting characters, the Holy Lance, the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, it's just an amazing story, the First Crusade.
Yes, it really is. You know, sometimes history is stranger than fiction. This has all the trappings, this First Crusade, of a really good sort of legendary tale.
Well, thanks, Dr. Hotle. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a great pleasure.
I would like to thank my guest today, Dr. Patrick Hotle. The featured brew was Absolution Belgian-style quadruple from the Crusader Brewing Company of Bakersfield, California. And once again, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, I have to say thank you to the legion of listeners and followers from over 70 countries and hundreds of cities across America. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to know what they have going on, just check out their link. It's in the description below as well. For more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.